everyone, and welcome back to Night Brothers Commentary once again. Today we are going to be continuing our series on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, particularly with the final three TV shows in Phase 4, i.e. Moon Knight, Miss Marvel, and She-Hulk. To be honest with you, I kind of forgot to do this before the new Ant-Man movie was released, so... well, anyway, ain't no time like the present, so without further ado, let's get started. So essentially, I'm going to start off with Moon Knight, and for the most part, I feel like this was actually probably the best show in Phase 4, honestly. Now, that's just my opinion, you may differ, but for me, overall, I really enjoyed the portrayal of dissociative identity disorder that Oscar Isaac did. I thought they were I thought his characters were very well done, and how basically and the balance between the two, I felt like that was really good. But overall, essentially, basically, this season really kind of starts with Stephen Grant, aka the first personality that Oscar Isaac portrays. Essentially, basically, he's kind of working at the British Museum in London. And he was supposed to go on a date with this girl, but that didn't work out because the other personality, Mark Spector, takes over, and he tries to steal the scarab that basically leads to the Egyptian goddess Ammit from this guy named Hero, who just happens to be serving as her avatar. And essentially, I'll just use the term duo in this case, considering that both Stephen Grant and Mark Spector are technically two different personalities. So essentially, they basically they steal the scarab, and they go back to London, where Hero basically tracks him down, he basically summons jackals that kind of basically do at least a serious bit of damage to the British Museum. And while Mark Spector basically kind of does take over the body, at least temporarily for the time being, to basically kind of protect them both and defeat the jackals, Stephen Grant gets fired for that. And essentially he kind of goes on this quest to see what's going on, like why am I having these gaps in my memory, essentially. He actually runs into Mark Spector's wife, and they kind of work together for a little bit. Eventually, Hero tracks him down again and he captures Stephen. Layla still manages to escape Hero's capture, and basically she kind of helps guide Stephen into being the Moon Knight, which is essentially the role of avatar for the Egyptian moon god Khonshu. Essentially, they kind of work together, but unfortunately, despite their best efforts, essentially, Hero manages to steal the scarab and goes to Egypt with the trio, essentially, with Stephen Grant, Mark Spector, and Layla all going with, basically following Hero. Essentially, Oscar Isaac's characters and Layla meet up with an associate of Layla's who kind of helps direct them to where they could try to find the tomb of Ammit without the scarab, and they eventually kind of get into a fight with said associate. And Khonshu essentially, basically, he kind of rewinds the night sky to the date where the constellation that was basically charted with the mummy corpse at that scene I just mentioned earlier, to basically kind of help them locate the tomb, which is successful, but unfortunately he basically kind of gets trapped into a Shwapti. Hopefully I pronounced it right. And so basically they're kind of powerless at the moment. Let me clarify. I should say Stephen Grant and Mark Spector are basically powerless, but they do manage to find the tomb. And then it turns out that Alexander the Great was the previous avatar for Amit. And unfortunately, basically, Oscar Isaac's characters basically get shot by Harrow and die in the tomb of Alexander the Great, and Harrow basically manages to steal Amit's Swapti, and essentially he basically kind of releases her and basically causes a whole bunch of crap to go down in Cairo. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself at that point. uh, essentially, basically, Mark and Stephen are essentially trapped in the Duat, which is basically the Egyptian underworld, and essentially they try to work together through their combined memories to essentially achieve balance within, to basically kind of, I guess, okay, let me explain. Essentially, the Egyptians kind of had this ceremony in the Duat for people who die. They basically have their heart weighed against a feather, and essentially, if the heart is heavier than the feather, that technically means you're guilty. Like this, like so. Basically, you just cease to exist entirely. Whereas if the heart is actually lighter than the feather, you're basically allowed to go to the field of reeds. Again, that's basically an oversimplification of of said ceremony, but overall, that's kind of what's happening in this episode. And sadly, Stephen Grant is forced to sacrifice himself for Mark Spector. And eventually, Mark decides that, yeah, I'm not cool with it. I'm going to go save Stephen, which he does. And Osiris essentially helps him escape the Duat and go back to the world of the living. However, back on Earth, essentially, Harrow basically wipes out the Ennead, which is basically like the main 9 gods in Egyptian mythology, and he basically kind of destroys their avatars and then releases Amit. And essentially, Khonshu and Amit basically kind of have like a giant uh, kai, kaiju battle, essentially. Whereas Harrow is basically squaring off against Layla, who is actually now the avatar for the Egyptian goddess Taleret, the hippo goddess. And Mark and Steven are basically kind of like, essentially, basically, Moon Knight and Layla are now teaming up to fight Harrow with their new powers, or at least her newfound powers and his, well, current powers. And essentially, they almost lose, but eventually they win, thanks to the help of a third personality that Mark has developed, essentially due to his trauma. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but essentially they win and they basically trap Amit. And they almost kill her. But Mark Spector basically decides not to kill Harrow, because he doesn't want to be a killer anymore. And he basically asks to be freed from his service to Khonshu, and that's kind of where the main series ends. The end credits scene, which I find incredibly fascinating, like probably everybody else, essentially. Basically, the third personality, Jake Lockley, is still technically in service to Khonshu, and he basically takes Harrow out of the psychiatric hospital and kills him. And I just kind of wonder where his character. I just wonder where the Moon Knight character is going to go. I mean, part of me kind of hopes he shows up in a Phase 5 movie. I'm not sure which one it would be. I guess my best guesses would probably be something kind of like, I want to say, possibly the Thunderbolts as well as Blade. Those are probably the 2 movies that make most sense to me. For the Blade movie, I just feel like his personality and his skill set really just kind of meshes well with Blade and Black Knight, who's also going to be in that movie, or at least I'm pretty sure he's going to be in that movie just based off the mid-credits scene in the Eternals movie. Whereas the Thunderbolts also really kind of helps along with that, because given everything that kind of happened in Cairo, one would think that the uh, Countessa would be watching, and maybe, I mean, I don't know. If I was Countessa, I would be watching what happened in Cairo and trying to find him and recruit him to Step Thunderbolts, because I'm pretty sure she's working with Ross at this point. To me, there's no way she's not working with Ross. But overall, I would say that's pretty much the gist for Moon Knight, essentially. Now, Miss Marvel, on the other hand, is basically a different animal, if you will. She basically she's just like a normal girl living in Jersey, a normal Pakistani girl living in Jersey, essentially. And she gets this amulet, this that's been kind of passed down her family through generations, essentially. And when she puts it on, she basically kind of gets her own superhuman powers. I want to say the show kind of differs a little bit in terms of the comics, because the comics basically have her as an inhuman, whereas this show basically kind of has her basically kind of following, I want to say, uh, like, I don't know, local Pakistani mythology with what is the term I'm looking for? Jinn. That's it, Jinn. Man, I'm struggling today, but essentially she's basically just kind of like she's basically like a descendant of a jinn from a separate dimension, and essentially she meets up with these other jinns through a girl from a guy she likes, named Kamran, who is also the son of said group, and essentially she kind of works with them initially to basically try to get them home, but eventually she realizes after traveling back to Pakistan just to kind of get more information about the woman that she saw in her visions. Essentially, she realizes that bringing him back to the newer dimension would essentially doom Earth. So she's like, nah, not having it. And she basically teams up with this other group who are working against the jinns. Uh, yeah, the Red Daggers, that's it. I mean, she basically teams up with the Red Daggers, and essentially she and this one other guy in the Red Daggers managed to succeed in stopping the clandestines. But she also goes back in time to basically save her grandmother from basically during the partition in India, where basically India and Pakistan basically became separate countries. And her mother, like, well, her great grandmother, who's basically the Jinn, she dies during the partition, and her, well, regular grandmother basically survives thanks to her help as a result of her traveling through time by accident. But essentially, yeah, she basically stops the clandestines from going back to the newer dimension, and Kamran's mother basically sacrifices herself. Whereas also, yeah, I forgot to mention that Kamran basically got captured by the Department of Damage Control. And essentially, he's kind of like the main villain for like the last arc of the show. And basically, Kamala and Kamran are essentially fighting over the fact that he doesn't want to go back to, well, I want to say it's a combination of A, not wanting to go back under the, doesn't want to go under the subjugation of the Department of Damage Control, but also he's he's pretty angry towards Kamala for what happened to his mother, who, because she basically sacrificed herself to basically stop the newer dimension from taking over Earth. And they kind of get in the fight, but essentially, uh, eventually, Kamran and Kamala basically kind of come to terms. Like, I mean, I don't know. I guess they just kind of eventually he kind of comes to his senses and basically kind of flees to Pakistan to basically get the protection of the Red Daggers. And Kamala is basically kind of, well, in a mid-credit scene, essentially, the bangle that the artifact that basically gave Kamala her powers in the first place, she basically puts it on again, and it starts emitting a strange glow, and basically she switches places with Carol Danvers, and that's essentially what happens at the end of the show. Or at the end of the first season, if you will. So basically, she's going to be showing up in the new Marvels movie for Phase 5. Uh, Overall, I didn't necessarily hate the show, but I don't necessarily I don't necessarily have the same respect for it as, like, say, Moon Knight or Falcon and the Winter Soldier or WandaVision. But that, again, that's just my opinion. You may differ. I mean, so anyway, basically to start off, Jennifer Walters is basically the cousin of Bruce Banner. They're uh, they're going on a vacation together essentially, and basically they encounter a Sakaran spacecraft, and they get in a car crash because of it, and unfortunately, Walter's blood basically kind of gets cross-contaminated with Banner's blood, and she basically kind of develops the same powers as him thanks to the gamma radiation in his blood. And essentially, she goes back after a brief training montage and a fight with Banner. She basically kind of goes back to her regular job, and also gets fired for using her powers to basically save people in a courtroom during a case. And then later gets hired by the company that got her fired in the first place. Probably not so ironically. And essentially, she kind of works with Wong on a few cases. The first case is basically the case with regards to the Abomination from the Incredible Hulk movie in 2008, and who also made a cameo appearance in Shang-Chi. And essentially, the She-Hulk show kind of picks up with that plot thread left off in Shang-Chi, because the Abomination was supposed to be in a Supermax, and Wong let him out for the Underground Fight Club, and I want to say it was Singapore, if I remember right, in that movie. I want to say it's Singapore. I could be wrong, but essentially, basically, Wong has to basically come in and testify for the Abomination's behalf, and essentially, the Abomination gets off on parole, and he's kind of like living as like some spiritual guru out in the middle of nowhere, and essentially, his plot there kind of gets dropped till the later end of the season, where the next case where Jennifer Walters is working with Wong is basically a former member of Wong's order, who's just kind of using his powers to basically, I guess, masquerade as like some cheap magician, like show magician, if you will. And unfortunately, that magician basically just kind of like releases a whole bunch of demons on Earth, and she basically kind of has to help Wong make things right. And kind of going back, basically she visits the Abomination again at his little ranch out in the middle of nowhere as part of I don't know, just like parole visit, I guess, if you will. And I guess she kind of comes to some form of realization about who she is and whatnot, especially with regards to her crappy romantic relationships, which, again, I felt like were probably the worst part of the show, honestly. That one muscular guy who literally just liked her for being She-Hulk. And then the other guy who actually seemed pretty legit until he basically just got a hold of her blood and just kind of scampered off because he was not really interested in her at all. He just wanted the blood for himself. Well, sorry, not for himself. He was working. He's the second guy who basically, he's working for this organization to basically try to bring down She-Hulk, or basically bring down She-Hulk and kind of get the Hulk's powers for themselves, essentially. And there was also another case where basically she had to essentially sue another woman called Titania, who was the woman who basically kind of broke into the the court case, and then as also the person who got Jennifer Walters fired in the first place. I mean, she basically filed a trademark for She-Hulk. I mean, God, that arc was just bad. Eventually, she basically kind of has to. I mean, she wins the case literally just because she basically created a dating profile as the Hulk. Well, She-Hulk, sorry. And I'm just like, would that actually hold up in court? Literally, like a dating profile with the name She-Hulk is actually what allowed her to basically defeat Titania's trademark? I don't know. I mean, that just seemed like, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the definition. I'm not going to pretend to be one, so I don't know. It did not. I mean, that story arc did not seem logical to me at all. But overall, essentially, she basically She also teams up with Daredevil to basically bring down this stupid frog villain, who, I mean, was just worthless. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Charlie Cox's Daredevil. I thought he was great. And it's amazing to have him back, especially now in the main MCU continuity where the other Netflix shows necessarily weren't, as far as I'm aware. I mean, they kind of shared it, but not really. But again, it was really nice just to kind of see him come back. And I guess her quote unquote relationship with Daredevil was actually relatively good. But the problem that I have with that is, I mean, part of me kind of wants. I mean, part of me really, because I know Daredevil's going to show up in the Phase 5 Echo show that's coming out. And I really kind of want. I mean, I want him to basically kind of date Echo as like he does in the comics. At least I'm pretty sure he does in the comics. And as far as I'm aware, I don't know if there's like a relationship between She-Hulk and Daredevil in the comics. So I don't know. To me, it just kind of fell out of the blue. Overall, I don't really know where She-Hulk is going to go in terms of the overall grand scheme of the MCU. I really don't. I mean, aside from Daredevil being in his own show as well as the Echo show, there really isn't much of a. I don't really see where it's going because I mean, I guess you could also argue the whole thing with Bruce Banner and his son on Sakaar. Uh, I mean, I guess that could tie into Secret Wars as well as the Secret Invasion show, maybe. I mean, I personally, I kind of doubt that though. I mean, but overall, I do feel like. I mean, for the most part, I mean, the shows were pretty interesting, but I guess, I mean, out of the three I've basically kind of gone over today. Moon Knight is by far the best one, with Miss Marvel being second, and like I've said, She-Hulk being last. I mean, overall, I did not like She-Hulk very much. I mean, for a whole bunch of reasons, but especially the writing. The writing, for the most part, was just cheesy and over the top in some places, as well as just being like overly stereotypical in others, and it just, I don't know, it just did not stick the landing personally. So essentially, basically, I mean, that's it for this episode, and the next episode is basically going to be I forget what's coming up next. I kind of want to say it's going to be a Secret Invasion. That's probably going to be the next episode, followed by probably Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And then that's basically it. So until next time, Nice Brothers Commentary, signing out.